most of you are probably aware, BASEL, was basically initiated, 25 years ago. BASEL II came out in 2002, and then as we have entered into this year, this is actually really recent news, that the Fed just voted 7-0, as has the European Union, to begin to put BASEL III into place, which is actually a little bit scary because many of the banks and financial institutions still haven't gotten their hands around BASEL II. And so as a result, there's this interesting point by Tim Ryan at SIFMA, the Security Industry and Financial Markets Association. This was actually, I think he had this line, it may have even been last week when SIFMA did their conference up in New York. And the key points are, will not hamper the ability of financial institutions to help finance economic growth and job creation. Remember yesterday I told you when we talked about FATCA, the banks in the UK spend about 80% of their IT income either directly or indirectly on regulatory pressures. BASEL III, with the new capital liquidity requirements, is going to have a very substantial effect on those expenditures. Now, most people, once again, most banks already have, and financial institutions already have a BASEL compliance capability into place. However, I'm going to share with you a case story of an organization that has BASEL II in place, but the way it takes place is rather interesting. In the IT industry, you've probably heard of the concept of spaghetti code. Okay, spaghetti code is this, I'll use a technical term, crap that kind of grows organically over about 30 or 40 years with multiple tentacles and whatnot, and slowly but surely begins to eat up all of the money in a corporation because it's so complex and it's so unwieldy and it's so inflexible. When we look at BASEL and we look at regulatory compliance, this is a place where we see a lot of spaghetti code that's appeared over the years, because these core systems, as we even talked about yesterday with FATCA, these core systems, once again, have grown in a mainframe environment as well as distributed environments over time. Plus, the other thing with BASEL that makes it interesting, this case study we're going to talk about, it's a very large multinational bank. This bank has grown by mergers and acquisitions all around the world. It's one of the largest banks in the world. It is a bank actually based in North America. One of the things we've actually seen going on with this bank is, as a result of growing by acquisition, they've acquired these small little local banks in areas like Penang, Malaysia, out in the outer reaches of like Estonia, places where there's no telecommunications infrastructure. So as a result, with BASEL compliance, as I think most of you are aware, BASEL requires an organization every month to aggregate all of this data and to report it back up. Well, when you're there in a small town in Estonia, and you've got probably pretty good mobile phones, but you really don't have a whole lot. Well, I should add, now they do, because there's a lot of money going into Eastern Europe, but in the past, over the past 5 to 10 years, there hasn't been a lot of computing infrastructure. So this particular bank was lucky to get an Excel spreadsheet. More of the time, they'd get like faxed information in on the actual capital that was within each one of their product portfolios. So if I'm in Estonia and I've got a fledgling credit card business and I've got savings and loan and I've got direct deposit and whatnot, this gets pretty challenging of how do I aggregate from, I think this bank is in 130 countries. How do I begin to aggregate all that information up? Now, once again, for those of you who are sitting at a credit union or a local bank, these same problems face you, just not maybe to the same degree. Coupled with this is the fact these regulatory requirements, as we touched on yesterday, they're changing. So this hampers IT's ability to go ahead and respond to it. Plus, obviously, IT isn't getting as much money these days to go ahead and do their work. So there need to be best practices put into place to handle this regulatory beast that we saw on the previous slide. First is we need to understand these regulatory systems and these challenges, they're going to need to evolve over time. They don't stay stable. They are not static. So developing a sustainable solution is mandatory. Next, you need to avoid building new systems, because if you start building new systems or if you start acquiring systems to handle a function, whether it be BASEL or Solvency II or Dodd-Frank or any of the other regulations, CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Board, if you're going to get point solutions to handle each one of those, everything's going to even get more spaghetti-oriented. I mean, I don't know, can things, I guess, turn from like spaghetti into fettuccine? I don't know. Anyways, there's got to be some analogy for that. So the last thing you want to basically think about, and we'll talk about this with this particular case study, is how to approach this in terms of a progressive, transformational approach, where you're utilizing the capabilities that you have on the mainframe, but you're doing it in concert with, I'm on the panel this afternoon talking about cloud. This organization is also pursuing a very active cloud strategy. So we'll touch a little bit on that in this session. I'll talk a little bit more about it during the panel this afternoon. So in December of last year, I went out to this client. I said, okay, we need to take a look at what you're doing with BASEL 2. They basically had kind of a three-stroke problem or step problem. And the first was that account information sat in all of these various repositories all around the world. And they have a monthly calendar. And during that monthly calendar, that information is aggregated up. It's thrown into a corporate data warehouse. The warehouse is split, divided, multidimensionally analyzed, et cetera, to go ahead and drive out what are known as BASEL exception triggers. Once again, for those of you who don't kind of like follow the BASEL world, which actually I didn't much until last year. The BASEL exception triggers are those either critical or sustainable errors that need to be reported to multiple regulatory agencies, not the least of which are organizations like the IMF and other organizations that basically control capital liquidity so that we don't enter into the same thing that happened in 2008. The way that they did, this particular organization, the way that they actually controlled it, so all this information moves into corporate, and now it gets basically filtered across. And people who are on particular portfolio lines like Diners Club or American Express or Visa or loans or mortgages, et cetera, they have to both submit information, check the error reports, determine whether there's an error, determine whether it can be corrected, and then submit the report so that somebody can sign it off. It's a concept of 4 eyes. So you've got 4-eye principle working here. Somebody submits, somebody ends up having to sign off. And this takes place actually in 2 parallel lines. So both the folks that own that product need to do that. The folks that own the financial and treasury aspects need to own that as well. So we've got a fairly complex, although an interesting challenge here. And the way that they decided to attack this about 5 years ago was they've got PeopleSoft based there, and I'm not going to like criticize PeopleSoft, Orasoft, whatever, because it's not a PeopleSoft issue, but they decided to take and tweak the workflow system in PeopleSoft to do this. Not a really good thing to do. Kind of tantamount to taking a screw and putting a screw in the wall with a hammer. I mean, you can do it, but it's just not very efficient. The last thing that came out of this, largely because PeopleSoft, was extremely limited visibility on what was going on. So the folks that were signing off and submitting didn't know what anybody else was doing. So we started taking a look at this and we said, gee, how can we do a better job of this? And the one thing that we noticed right off was that this was a perfect situation for going ahead and putting a business process management solution into place. And in fact, that was what they were trying to do with the PeopleSoft solution, but they were doing it in a rather diverse kind of way. So the key challenges they had, unstructured tasks, people calling other people on the telephone, emails tracking back and forth. They had to do this BASEL sign off and submit, though, within a period of 7 days. Because if there are any issues, the corporate governance folks need to get involved. They need to provide root cause to try to determine why those errors exist. So the inflexible workflow made it very difficult. I mean, how do you do all of this in 7 or 8 days? I mean, challenging, to say the least. There was no notification, so that individuals that had signed off, the submitters wouldn't know that they had signed off until somebody called them on the phone and said, okay, it's processed, please go. So as a result, when they were doing their BASEL processing, oftentimes there would be phone calls on the 6th day of the month on their monthly calendar where somebody would be calling up at about midnight saying, okay, it's yours, sign it off. This is an extraordinarily bad way to go ahead and handle things. And I should also add that this fits kind of hand in glove with the way that some of the litmus test work is going on as well. That there is this delay, if you will, in terms of not only aggregating information, but processing information through the system. Very limited integration, lack of control, and very, very poor visibility. So what we did was we stated first that by bringing a business process capability into place as well as a business rules capability, and I'm not going to mention names because there's a lot of BPM technologies and rules technologies. Obviously, we were using our own, but this isn't a vendor pitch. It's to more give you, I think, some things to think about from a regulatory standpoint. And the ideas here were pretty clear. One was we wanted to automate the workflow. We wanted to get away from electronic mail, telephone calls, et cetera. We wanted to automate exception processing so that the exception processing wasn't tied to a telephone where some manager had to be called to determine what was going on. We wanted to go ahead and provide for more proactive task completion so that people at any point in time knew exactly where this process was. We wanted to be able to monitor the tasks. All of these things kind of came into play, and the more interesting thing was, once again, I did this workshop in December, and they said, oh yeah, by the way, Scott, we want to be able to prototype and show a solution in April. So I said, okay, well, can we go ahead and get you to pay for some services? Now, once again, I'm on the vendor side. Normally when I go to clients, no matter how big or small, and you go, would you like to pay for some services? They said no. They said, won't you just do this for us? I'm an architect. Architects don't do code. But in the case of this particular bank, I made an exception. So I went ahead and I took my architect hat off and I put my developer hat on. And we started going ahead and using a tool, and this will be about the only time you'll hear me mention a product. We have a tool in IBM called BlueWorks Live. BlueWorks Live is a cloud-based process discovery tool. Saying, process discovery, what's that? Process discovery is my ability to sit out with business users and try to figure out what the nature of the problem is, to document it, to effectively go ahead and try to understand it. Now, BlueWorks Live is one of multiple process discovery tools out there, but what it allows me to do is to understand where those mainframe systems are at, who's handing off work to who else, and how, in fact, that work gets negotiated, who gets notified at specific points. This is the very, very, very high-level diagram. For those of you who can kind of see, for example, one of these boxes over here has a little plus on it. If you double-click on that, it basically explodes into a sub-process. And if you look at that sub-process, there are little sub-processes in there. So overall, it was a relatively complex task to do this, but it was actually kind of a fun exercise. I say, I'm an architect, I don't code, but I decided it'd be kind of fun to do as a hobby. So we also proposed kind of this high-level architecture. We have user interfaces on the top. We have this process layer then that was controlling automation, transformation of all these different assorted types of data from Excel and text files and database, et cetera. We had a thin layer of reporting capabilities, and then we basically had then these applications in the bottom. And you can see we had like portfolio data sitting out on a mainframe, sitting out on a big 390Z enterprise environment. We had a core banking system, which was also sitting on a mainframe. We had a set of entitlements. These entitlements, actually, I didn't completely work this one in. Like many banks, probably some of the ones you work for, they have their own custom entitlement system. So they use, basic security protocols, things like Kerberos and SAML and whatnot. But the entitlements themselves, they basically store in their own custom database. So we had to interface with that. Reports, et cetera. So this was a relatively challenging task, more challenging because the first quarter of every year at a hardware or software vendor is always a little bit challenging. For those of you who sit on the client side, you probably understand that fourth quarter rolls around and we need to make sure that the books are right. So by first quarter, we're also scurrying around trying to make sure that we can make our revenue numbers to make our stakeholders happy. So trying to do this at the same time of being the lead architect for North America was a little bit of a challenge, but hey, I'm always up for a good challenge. We used kind of an interesting methodology, and this is a methodology that we've come up with over the last few years, which I'll just generally refer to as Agile BPM. I won't go into a lot of depth on it. If any of you are interested, I'll give you the reference. I just wrote an article actually on this for IBM. But the idea is to not only do this process discovery that we talked about earlier with the business users, it's also to do this Agile BPM with the users. And each one of those playbacks represents a set of core deliverables. So I was giving these guys deliverables, in addition to doing my day job, every 2 to 2.5 weeks. And I was walking with the business users through the user interfaces, et cetera, of how we plan to build this. Bottom line is, me, the architect, the guy that doesn't code. Fortunately, I didn't have to do too much Java. Most of what I did was actually scripting languages. But we built a system that consists of 16 user interfaces, 12 reports. I think there's 17 emails that I programmed in the system. And I did this in my spare time over 6 weeks. Now, this is not a production system by any means. However, what it's done is now the bank is looking at this in terms of risk compliance across other areas, not simply Basel II, but as well some of the ways that they're looking at doing some of the swap clears, some of the Dodd-Frank work that's going to need to be done here over the coming months and whatnot. And the bottom line is they can't afford to spend a year to a year and a half developing these systems. So what we've put in place here not only is a set of technology, and technology, quite honestly, guys, technology changes every day. Technology really, in the end result, it's very important. I mean, you need good, strong technology there to drive this stuff, but you also need expertise and you need a method to go ahead and do it. And what this did was it showed this bank that they could, in fact, have this very accelerated program to develop a relatively complex process in a very short amount of time. Now, obviously, it was me doing it. I'm a pretty bright guy and got good kidneys. However, at the same time, I think the thing that now has come out of this is in the wake of Basel III coming out, they now realize they have an ability to do things better. And this particular bank, as I say, has had, they've had a few troubles around litmus testing and whatnot and liquidity in the bank, partly because of this problem I mentioned earlier, 135 countries, all different kinds of formats of data, multiple silos, et cetera. So bottom line, summary, requirement and regulatory challenges are just going to grow over time. Just accept it. They never go away. We like to talk in IT that, standards, same thing. Standards never go away. There just get to be more and more of them. But as a result of that, they lead to greater and greater complexity of our code. They become more and more cumbersome. It leads to this spaghetti code that I was talking about before. But more importantly, it means that the business doesn't have time to react quickly to the change in the market. So when Dodd-Frank comes out, or when the CFPB comes out, or when Basel III comes out, these banks are hamstruck in terms of what to do. And that takes us really to the kind of last bullet to sort of leave you with is, so how do you attack this? Well, I'll tell you, over 15 years of doing this, I've seen all three of these things play out. First is, I've seen the companies go ahead and basically nuke their current systems, try to build them from scratch again from a regulatory standpoint. I've seen companies buy like off-the-shelf solutions to handle individual components of it, or where we're moving to now is this concept of transformation, which we show down on the bottom. Success and failure, you like the signs? It works. Where they basically extend and enhance their existing systems. So this means going ahead, understanding, using that process discovery we talked about before, to understand what the context is of the problem at hand, to be able to build on that and to be able to take it forward instead of trying to rip all of this out and trying to rebuild it from scratch. And so with that, as I say, if any of you are beginning to start looking at Basel III, Basel I was thin. Basel II was a little thicker. Basel III is huge, okay, in terms of capital liquidity requirements. Start looking at it today. Pretty much the same thing I told you with FATCA. Because Basel III should be pretty much in place by, over probably the next 2 to 3 years. And it'll roll in slowly. But if you're not prepared to deal with it, you're going to have some real challenges ahead of you. Feel free to come by, talk to us and whatnot. And thanks for your time. Appreciate it.